Welcome, everybody. This is a Jacobin stream. If you haven't yet, hit subscribe. And I'm very, very honored to be moderating this panel between three very important scholars, including, which I'll introduce in a moment. This is, of course, Stay at Home, Boerne, South Carolina, and the Black Vote Mystique that we're going to be talking about tonight as part of the Stay at Home series until you shouldn't stay at home anymore. I guess you'll still be at home when you're watching Jacobin in the future, even post-plague, if we ever get to post-plague. I want to introduce who is with us tonight. We have Professor Willie Leggett. He's a professor of emeritus at political science at South Carolina State University. His areas of specialization are American political development, particularly focusing on the South, on Black Americans, social movements, and political theory. Adolph Reed Jr., as we all know, he's a powerhouse of the American left. He's a professor emeritus of political science at the University of Pennsylvania, specializing in race and American politics. He's the founding member. He is a founding member, of the U.S. Labor Party. He's a contributing editor to the New Republic. He's been published in dozens of other outlets, including Jacobin, and his books include Class Notes and many more. Cedric Johnson is an associate professor of African American Studies and Political Science at the University of Illinois at Chicago, an author of Revolutionaries to Race Leaders, Black Power, and the Making of African American Politics, as well as the editor of the Neoliberal Deluge, Hurricane Katrina, Late Capitalism, and the Remaking of New Orleans. And we also want to thank Philadelphia DSA, Labor for Boerne, for being co-sponsors of this event. Philadelphia DSA has done an incredible amount of organizing, particularly around Medicare for All. And of course, the Sanders 2020 campaign is one of the finest social political education programs in the country. Labor for Boerne has been crucial, has played a crucial role over the past year in organizing union members and union workplaces around the Sanders campaign. And I want to also really briefly shout out, and I think, Kale, you have the graphics for this. There is a group of Teamsters organizing in Philadelphia, and essentially you can help their GoFundMe. I mean, there's nothing surprising about it, but it's hard to absorb how disgusting this is. These folks are, as you know, I mean, they're working at UPS, they're delivering packages, and UPS is not providing hand sanitizers, not providing basic protections, including sanitizers, gloves, and masks that will, of course, save workers' lives, but also protect the general public. And what this fundraising will do will be allowing them to stage independent labor action so they can get the resources they need and organize beyond that. Those are some really concrete things that folks can do right now. So I'm going to set the stage for a few minutes, and then we'll get to Professor Leggett. I've kind of taken to joking about the sort of corporate Democrats sort of Green Mile strategy in terms of how they fetish part of the African American vote to valorize candidates like Joe Biden, and actually more broadly, and we see a lot of academic research, I guess you can call it, sort of indicating that not only are social programs and a kind of robust universalist social safety net not part of dismantling various legacies of oppression and hierarchy in the United States, including, of course, racism, but that in fact they're actually not looked upon fondly by African American voters. This is a much bigger cultural narrative. And there's a number of problems with this that I think obviously the folks here are going to go into great detail on. But a couple of things that have always caught me are, one, that the idea of a singular unitary Black vote is a big problem, even in its own terms. That inside the Black community as a whole, I always use a really small example, and it's very New York centric, so I apologize if you're not in New York. But in order to even and this is, I'm trying to use a pretty narrow difference so that we can open a much bigger differences from there. But if you look at the political tradition of Harlem, going back to even a guy like Charlie Rangel, actually, and before him, Clayton Powell and so on, you're talking about a politics that was in a lot of ways formed by great migration, different types of Democratic Party clubs interacting with the city, with broader Democratic Party of New York City. You go to Brooklyn, and you see this still in congressional representation today with people like Yvette Clarke, is heavily, heavily, heavily influenced by Caribbean migration patterns to Brooklyn. Talking about families coming from Jamaica, from Barbados, from Guyana, and so on. Even within this city, in relatively similar contexts, we're still talking about, urban political machines, Democratic Party in New York. It's not vast differences. But if you wanted to understand how Manhattan worked versus Brooklyn worked with regards to the Black vote, one would not apply directly to the other. You're already talking about a vastly more complicated set of issues you need to take on. So when and I will use the fashionable parlance of the day, and I'll use it sincerely, when you talk about a unitary singular vote, you erase a lot of very, 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 very important geographic distinctions and class distinctions. The Sanders campaign really leaned into the age distinctions and generational distinctions, which I know we'll get to, but it's much bigger than that. There's different class positions. And as I said, geography and different relationships across the country with, as an example, say African American voters in a Milwaukee or a Detroit to the labor union movement versus, say, in South Carolina, which also, by the way, would track with white or Hispanic voters as well, because these places have different traditions of labor organizing and different state policies around labor. So what happens is, and the reason this conversation is important, is that on the most crude terms, it's used as a cudgel and as a blunt instrument to defame and undermine a left social democratic project. And it's used in a way that undermines the broader struggle, of course, of all working class people, all poor people, all people with a labor agenda. And it, by doing that, also creates another kind of magical essentialist discourse about Black voters in general, which again echoes and kind of reinforces some of America's greatest sins and also most just kind of embarrassing current white liberal professional class cultural practices, like the Black electorate is a giant assist meme for them in a Twitter argument versus a vital and incredibly complicated and important demographic. And the last thing I just want to add too is that we see this kind of hysterically in a depressing way with Joe Biden, that Joe Biden, who is the main beneficiary right now of this kind of pseudo woke politics, personally is somebody who's legislated from the right and across a variety of issues, from criminal justice to anti-labor to trade, for decades. And that the same folks, sometimes literally the same folks, and at the very least these folks' predecessors, were the pioneers of Democratic Party race baiting in the 80s and 90s, when Bill Clinton triangulated to the right, and discourses on welfare and crime told essentialist stories that demonized Black voters, and again were a cudgel to do things like, I guess, what we call welfare reform. Now they're getting repackaged to explain why we can't do anything materially for, say, Appalachia. But that might be a related conversation for another day. So I think this stuff is very important. It requires some actual historical grounding and a lot of distinction making. And I can't think of three people better to do it. I know myself, I've read all three of these gentlemen, and I've been fortunate to develop a bit of a friendship and mentorship with Dr. Reed, have him on my show a lot. I'm just very honored to do this. And I'm going to start with Professor Willie Leggett, who's going to kind of lay the ground for, or excuse me, my apologies. I'm starting with Professor Cedric Johnson, correct? Say, I should have had this in front of me. Who's going to sort of lay the bigger groundwork here of the dynamics we're talking about and how we got to the place we're in.
All right, thanks, Michael. I'll just say from the start that I was leery about doing this discussion, given the backdrop of the pandemic. I'd expressed some concerns about adding something even more depressive, revisiting South Carolina on top of the pandemic, and that was all before Sanders exited the race. So it seems like whatever concerns I had before or have been compounded. I'll also say that in preparing my comments, it felt like the weight of a eulogy, to be honest. I'll try to wrest some sort of meaning from the absurdity of it all, but I think that we're living through some tough times. I think there's a lot we can learn from South Carolina, and what I'll do in the time that I have is really lay out three core points, and I'll tell them to you. I'll do like a drill sergeant. I'll tell you what I'm going to say, and then I'm going to say it. The first point that I want to make and try to push is that the Black population is simply not a constituency, right? I think that's one of the notions that animates. You alluded to that just now, Michael, in your opening comments, but I think that's one of the notions that really animates a lot of thinking, both among academics, but also among different aspects of the public. And I want us to try to get away from that. I mean, I think even with the notion of the African American community, which a lot of us use as a euphemism and as a habit of speech, it carries its own dangerous freight, right? Because we're talking about 40 million plus people. And so I think it clouds our thinking, and I want to try to push us away from that. So that'll be the first point. The second point that I want to build is to touch on this argument we've heard over and over that Sanders didn't reach black voters because he was not assertive enough when it came to matters of race. So I want to push back against that as a false notion. Um, I think that ultimately it's false in terms of what Sanders was actually doing. It also assumes that the other candidates were better on race. As you just alluded to, it's not like Biden was. I think the other problem, and this is maybe the bigger issue for us to deal with, is that the claim has little to do with what the positions of blacks actually are, right? The what black politics is like in real time and space. It has more to do with setting up a particular set of brokerage arrangements between the person who's making the case and, in this case, the Sanders campaign. The last point that I'll try to develop has to do with something that Sanders has said repeatedly in the last months of the campaign, which is that we were winning the ideological battle, but clearly not the electoral one. I think that that's certainly true, but I want to add a bit of a finer point because I think the defeat in places like Alabama, Arkansas, and South Carolina, even though it's been framed mainly in terms of a problem of black voters, not necessarily warming to the campaign, I think there's something else there that's at work that we should touch on. And I think it's a problem that an important frontier for us to fight on going forward. So, on this matter of the black population not being a constituency, if we think about a constituency as a group of people with a shared set of interests, political interests, that's certainly not the case for African Americans, right? And it hasn't been the case for at least the last half century. It wasn't even the case during Jim Crow segregation, right? You've always had different ideologies, different political interests operating within the black population. And I think as I and a number of other folks, Adolph, Willie, Toure Reed, all sorts of other folks have shown in their own work, when we talk about the black population, what we're really looking at is an ensemble of different interests, right? And they're constantly shifting. There's moments when they may converge or overlap, but they all often contradict each other and are in direct conflict with one another. And I think we need to focus more closely on that. How many times have we've been engaged with people in conversations and they'll preface whatever they're going to say by saying, "Well, I know the black community is not a monolith," and then they proceed to say something really monolithic about the black population, some sort of vile oversimplification. We really got to get beyond that. I've been amazed. I mean, I feel like I shouldn't even have to make this point about the black population not being a constituency, but I'm amazed by how many graduate students, activists, professors, other people who should know better, still can't really talk about black life in all of its broad um, complexities They can't talk about the lives of Black people in the same ways they might talk about other populations. And so I think it's unfortunate that we are, this late in the game and still having these same problems. This notion, has its roots in Jim Crow segregation and the conditions of disenfranchisement, right? A situation where Black people are not allowed to take part fully in public life, and therefore a number of intermediaries emerge over time to serve as brokers within the context of local machine politics in cities, but also in relationship to the White House and other governing bodies across time. We still see it now, and I think there's a couple of problems that we should be clear about. Um, Let me give one quick example of how this operates, how it's operating now, not directly related to South Carolina, but in terms of COVID-19. We've all heard the reports about Milwaukee, Chicago, and also New Orleans, and the high levels of racial disparity in terms of COVID-19 deaths. Almost immediately, there was a rash of panel discussions, webinars, other things that are happening to try to make sense of this and to frame it as a distinctively Black problem. What that does, and again, this kind of goes back to your opening point, it cuts off some of these concerns that Blacks on the south side of Chicago and East Chicago, which borders Indiana, people in New Orleans, all the way up through along the Mississippi to Baton Rouge, where we see these high levels of death from COVID-19. It separates their concerns and their experiences from those of other populations in the rural hinterlands who are probably also going to suffer in the same ways. But I think there's a need to sort of frame it differently. Wouldn't it be more accurate, more helpful in terms of interpretation, and more helpful politically to situate the problem within the broader neoliberal rollback of public health in a place like Louisiana, right, where we saw the dismantling of the charity hospital system under the regime of Bobby Jindal? Wouldn't that be a more helpful way of talking about this, right? And in terms of building a broad public support for some different kind of politics than framing it as an exceptional condition of Blacks. And so I think there's a interesting set of dynamics. We always see it pop up, but we see it once again in this situation. I think it does more damage, right, than it helps to advance the kinds of concerns that we have and that were amplified by the Sanders campaigns. The second point, this claim that Sanders didn't reach Black voters because he was not assertive enough on matters of race is not only false, but it's also a ruse, right? It's a wrong-headed strategy that did little to advance the campaign for those who made it, right? If you think back to 2016, in the run-up to South Carolina, it was Ta-Nehisi Coates, right, the writer, who made this argument that Sanders should adopt reparations as a way of connecting with the Black population. This time, we saw something similar in the form of Black academics circulating a letter, again, trying to pressure Sanders to take a more assertive anti-racist position. I think in both cases, the underlying assumption is that race is the main animating concern among African Americans across class, age, different regions, urban, rural, suburban, small town contexts. And that's just not the case. I mean, I think there's much more going on in terms of what's shaping Black voters' decisions within these primary contests. The other thing that we should be leery of is what constituency did these people represent? In the case of Coates, surely we know he's a popular writer, but does he actually have a concrete constituency and following? And do Black people writ large prioritize reparations in their day-to-day concerns in the ways that he is as a writer? Is one thing we should point to. I think that there's an old quote from Langston Hughes that I first came across in some of Adolph's work. And he said back during the Jim Crow period, any Negro with a new suit and $5 in his pocket could lay claim to being a Negro leader. I think the bar is considerably lower, right, in our own time. I think, you don't need a suit. You probably don't even need $5. You just need a Wi-Fi signal and a burner phone in order to engage in the atmosphere of laying claim to leadership. And we have to be leery of that. I mean, I think it's somewhat unprincipled, right? When you see people come forward and make demands on a campaign outside of established channels, actual constituencies, leadership of particular organizations. And I think it's also disruptive because it totally changed the tone of things, I think, going forward, both in 2016, but again um, in this last contest. And again, I don't think it actually changed things for the better, right? It was more in the way of a sabotaging move than anything else when we look back on it. So I think there's another set of concerns that explains the weak support for Sanders in the southern states, which has more to do with the conservative political climate in those states, conservative conditions, and the kind of pragmatic voting behavior that encourages among certain corners of the population. So again, I think we are winning the ideological battle nationally, as many people have said, some of the concerns that we would have considered, beyond the pale of polite political conversation are now front and center. And many people are talking about progressive social policies in ways that they haven't ever before. I can recall a conversation I had with a group of graduate students at NYU back in 2016. And one student said that he actually felt Sanders wasn't socialist enough. And I laughed because I was thinking, I remember a time, I'm old enough to remember a time when you couldn't even use that word in regular conversations, let alone in a major election, right? To actually designate yourself, to identify as a socialist, and still have traction within a national election. So I think things have changed dramatically, but not for the entire country, right? And I think that may be maybe more substantial than the notion of black voters not connecting to Sanders because of some alleged lack of an anti-racist set of policies. I think that the problem may go to um, the fact that many of these people working within very conservative states, states that are run by Republicans, states where they're greatly outnumbered by Republican voters, and where it's highly unlikely, in their minds at least, that somebody with a democratic socialist identity and platform can advance all the way to the White House. So I think I wouldn't say it's cynicism. I think it was more of a pragmatic, maybe even instrumental type voting and choosing somebody like Biden for many voters, maybe not all. And we saw clearly in the race as well that black functionaries in South Carolina were used to engage in some red baiting, both in 2016 and again now, right? I mean, they used some of the same rhetoric that we heard at the national level to discredit the kinds of social democratic policies that Sanders was advancing. I mean, first there's the dismissiveness of, this is all about the young people, right? The young people on board, which is what people always say about the left, right? This is just a problem of youthful exuberance, right? And not necessarily some broader thought out and longer standing politics. We also saw the quip from Joe Biden and others, on the debate stage, how are you going to pay for some of these things you're talking about repeatedly? And I think that played well, especially when you had on the ground someone like James Clyburn, both times, in both elections, moving to discredit both tuition-free higher education as well as Medicare for all at every chance that he got. The same thing was true for John Lewis, right? They were saying things like nothing in life is free. People don't want free stuff, as a way to again undermine, and recall this idea that this is like pie in the sky liberalism. It's the type of politics that'll never happen. It'll never take place in this moment, and we need to be a little bit more conservative. So I think we still have a long ways left to travel, and I hope people don't hear me, mishear me or misrepresent what I'm saying about the South. I grew up in Louisiana, um, and I still spend a lot of time in southern states, connected to North Carolina. I spent a lot of time there as well. And it looks different there, right? I think a Sanders campaign in a place like Chicago, it feels possible because we have high union density, we have all sorts of other progressive campaigns and organizations happening here. And so when you look at the campaign, you interface with it much differently. We have socialists in the city council here. That's different from being in a place like Mississippi. It's different from being in Kentucky or Tennessee. And so I think that this is where the work is for us going forward. It's trying to build the support for that politics, which is I know Willie and Adolph have been doing that kind of work, but building it brick by brick and going door to door to make it happen. So I'll stop there, and I'm interested in what other people are saying.
So I just want to say I'm going to go right to Professor Leggett, but I every time I heard somebody say that Bernie Sanders wasn't enough of a socialist, you know who thought he was definitely enough of a socialist is the entire corporate power structure of the United States. So I think that's worth keeping in mind. I understand that he didn't put on a Mao cap or whatever, but they weren't, when he dropped out, I think the stock market went up several hundred points, just even on the official leaving of what was already a pretty much a done campaign. But anyways, Professor Willie Leggett, I think you're going to talk about this and also get a little bit specifically to South Carolina.
Right. What I want to do is first present who voted and how they voted, what the issues were, and try to explain to some extent the consequences of the primary in South Carolina. And apparently, Bernie Sanders' campaign picked up on some of the criticism that was made for 2016 from Black political operatives, and he spent an enormous amount of time on trying to build support in South Carolina. Almost immediately after 2016, they organized Our Revolution. It was co-chaired by one of the persons who worked his campaign in South Carolina. Nina Turner came to the state all 2017, 2018. Since 2018, Sanders came to the state over 20 times, had over 70 campaign events. He spoke to Black colleges, talked about this innovative plan for HBCUs. He endorsed Jim Clyburn's 10-20-30 program, where these poor counties get 10% of various federal funds. And he was successful in getting the support, an endorsement of about 36 elected officials, 9 Black Black representatives from Berkeley, Charleston, Richland County. He got the endorsement of the several mayors. So he had done his work relative to 2016 in trying to build support with the African American population in South Carolina. However, if you look at the polls from roughly January to the end of February, it was about Sanders only polled about 14% until about the middle of February, when Biden was at 24%. This is average poll, and Sanders at 20%. And this is when the establishment and the media really began to pile on Sanders, and particularly after he that began to obviously change, and then but Sanders won in Iowa, New Hampshire, and Nevada. And at that time, before coming to South Carolina, of course, the media and everybody began to jump on Sanders. The world is now about to come to an end if Sanders get the nomination. So by the time by February 29th, then the polls were down, and we know the outcome. Who voted? Well, 59% of the voters were women. And of the 59% of women, 49% of them voted for Biden. 50% of the voters in the primary were Black. 61% voted for Biden, and Sanders received 17% Black vote. 2016, he got 14%. And I think this is important here too, because that's a 3% difference, given all his work in terms of the endorsements, even though it is minor compared to what Biden received, but nevertheless it's significant compared to what he received the last time. And his workers, right? He increased his staff, but doubled his staff. All the staff that I saw, 90% of the staff had to have been Black in South Carolina. So with all of that, then it also raised a question about the significance of these Black operatives in terms of getting out the vote, right? And that's their calling card. And so whatever was at work here with Sanders is a bit more than just get more Black staff workers, right? So we look at the age group. Sanders did get the under 44 vote. Right? He received 52% of white voters under the age of 30. However, got only 38% of Black votes under 30, but that's his larger percent of Black votes he received. Sanders received 40% of the white votes between 30. I'm sorry, Biden received 40% Sanders received 4% of the white vote between 30 and 44, but only 22% of Black votes in that same age category. Even though Sanders did much better with voters under 44, they only constituted 10% of the voters, right, for the white voters, and only 16% of Blacks were under the age of 40. So that raised other questions about how much energy you put on younger voters. And of course, Biden won hands down with the older voters. He received 64% of Black voters, over 75, over 69, I'm sorry. And it's important to note, I think, that 30% or 31% of the voters in the Democratic Party did not identify themselves as Democrat, but as independents, and Republicans, 5% identified themselves as Republicans, and 26% identified themselves as independents, and Biden received 33% of their vote compared to Sanders' 26%. Now, what were some of the issues? Well, first, I think it's important because this also explains how people vote. 53% of the voters said that they voted for a candidate who they thought they could win, and 52% of those voters voted for Biden, and that's what the campaign was all about: who could win. And you can expect, of course, Black voters to be influenced by that as well. It's key here. The four top issues in the campaign was race relations, healthcare, climate change, and income inequality. And it's important to note that healthcare, 51% of the voters listed healthcare as a major issue, and 21% listed income inequality as an issue, major issue, and 17% race relations. And it's also important, as we talk about healthcare, 41% mentioned seeing that as a major issue. 49% supported Medicare for all, government plan, instead of private insurance. 44% of those voters voted for Biden, and only 29% of those voters voted for Sanders. Of the 21% of the voters who saw income inequality as a major problem, 45% of those voters voted for Biden, and 23% voted for Sanders. Of the voters, 8%, only 8% said that the American economic system works well, while 53% said that it needs overhaul. So on these three indicators here, healthcare, economic inequality, and the voters' view of the economic system would suggest that these voters probably would have voted if they followed their preferences, and a candidate that's more in line with their preferences would probably have voted for Sanders. Moreover, one of the reasons people have always been concerned and raised questions about whether Black people vote in their interests is because in terms of their material interests, Medicare for all, free higher education, living wage, all those issues would certainly benefit the material interests of the majority of Black people. So the puzzle, on one hand, is given how they respond to these exit polls and giving where they fit within the class arrangement, meaning the majority of Black people fit within the class arrangement of American society, it seems to be in their material interest to vote for Sanders, but why didn't there? But more important for me, it seems, and we can explain maybe why people vote the way they did, and we can talk about that in a minute. But it's also a most important question that we're probably able to get a better hand on is trying to explain the role of the Black political elite in the discourse that they engage in and how they explain politics of the people who they claim to represent. How do they define the issues? How do they define what's possible? And see that as a mechanism in terms of how they try to shape Black political participation. Because that discourse is just not taking place to be taking place. They're building support for a particular program. And how do they build that support for a particular program is they define these issues in very narrow racial terms. But before we move, before we get to that, I do want to say and try to explain to some extent, how do we explain this overwhelming support for Biden, given his political history? And part of that has to do, of course, with a certain point that Cedric has made, and the expectation, I think, that Black people have from electoral politics. Over the last 40 years, they have been beat across the head about limiting their expectations. I had a quote that I forgot to mention, actually, but during my field work, I had a state senator said to me that they made a mistake, in his word, by socializing Black people to believe that their problems could be solved through politics. And this is him feeling pressured to respond to those problems, or at least expecting that he would respond to them when he knew or felt that he could not. And to some extent, certainly since the 90s, since the Jesse Jackson campaign, Black policy has largely been about suppressing or moderating Black political demands and defining their expectations. So why would why so? Well, I don't think we should take those endorsements lightly. And I think if we listen to how Jim Clyburn endorsed Biden when he talked about his wife, we're gonna get the clip. Okay.
All right. Okay, this is Jim Clyburn.
I decided, after that experience last Friday, with that elderly constituent. In my background, experiences, and studies of Martin Luther King Jr., that I would break my silence today. But I want the public to know that I'm voting for Joe Biden. South Carolinians should be voting for Joe Biden. I know Joe. We know Joe. But most importantly, Joe knows us.
It's about how he talks about that endorsement.
Okay, right. Okay, so the point about Jim Clyburn and the clip is that to a large extent, Black political elite politics is shaped according to, in relationship to their relationship with their white colleagues. And so what they do, and one of the things they do in persuading Black people how they should vote, is to suggest largely that they know these people and therefore Black people can trust them. Because this again about defining these problems in terms of race. I am one of y'all, he knows me, I know him, we can trust him. It says very little or nothing about policy. So Clyburn talks about his wife loving Joe. And he says, I know Joe, Clyburn said. We know Joe, but most importantly, Joe knows us. That endorsement was important. 40% of the voters in South Carolina said that named Clyburn as a major factor for their Biden vote.
Wow. But
Clyburn wasn't the only one. Clyburn wasn't the only one to make that assertion. A state senator, Kempson from Charleston, said Joe Biden is the candidate that we trust. So the point is that is about this trust, is about we know him, but it's not only Jim Clyburn. It will be almost unreasonable to expect or to think that the majority or significant number of Black people will vote contrary to the other officials that they have voted for. Right, so they looked at the Black mayors that they have voted for. They look back to state legislators they have voted for. If they look at the congressperson that they have voted for, they look at the NAACP, what NAACP don't endorse candidates, but if they look around them and the people who they look to for some clues about political activity and political behavior, 90% or so of these people are supporting Joe Biden or either being silent on the issue. So it's reasonable. And when we think about Clyburn, I think something else is more important. I mean, Clyburn is one of these candidates has really groomed his base and not just in a symbolic way either. I mean, he has a relationship with the Black mayors, he has a relationship with other elected officials in the state, he has a relationship with the ministers in the state, he has a relationship with the HBCUs in the state. So so what he says matter not simply because he is the congressperson, but he is the congressperson that has really delivered some concrete things to sectors of the Black population there. So the problem, as I see it, is that the Black political elite has been able to use their representation as a way of negotiating goods and services or goods for themselves and a very small sector of the Black community. And they're largely successful for this for two reasons. One is that they have been very successful along with their intellectual supporters Black intellectual supporters because they all share the same kind of class interests and worldview in terms of seeing these problems in narrow racial terms. And secondly, and they've been very successful with this, and is if you don't support us, the boogeyman gonna get you. And that is that we can, as the many legislators used to tell me in South Carolina, if we can't do anything, we can stop bad things from happening.
Hmm.
And Joe Biden is certainly better than Donald Trump, and he can win. And when everybody telling you that, then what we expect voters to do. Well, what that means is a lot of work for us to do. And that means on one level trying to engage, and I think particularly on one level the Black community, to challenge the representativeness of these folks who claim to represent Black folks, to complicate that, reveal the conflict and interest in which these people work within, the conflict between their relationship with corporate America and Wall Street and claiming to represent poor Black people. And we just have to honestly have that discussion. And I think perhaps just as importantly, a real discussion about big public policies. Convince them that, yeah, this is something the state ought to do. And this is something can be done. And I'll leave it with that.
It's great. I just want to note a couple of things. I'm not sure how we'll get to the questions, but first, actually, I'm remiss. I have to do two quick plugs. Tomorrow at 1:00 New York time, Anna Kasparian and I are debuting our new show, which is going to be on this channel, Weekends with Anna Kasparian and Michael Brooks. I like the new simple show title era. Like it's on the weekend and it's us. No, we get back to like the General Mills branding era, which I like. And then tomorrow night there's going to be another Stay at Home with Matt Brunig, and he's going to talk about those Nordic states that Bernie likes to talk about. How do they actually work, and how do they look? You don't got to romanticize them, but the reality is that they do deliver some very important public provisions for folks, and we need to understand how that actually takes place. I just want to note, I'd like to circle back to a couple things. I want to later talk about why brokerage politics, how is it distinct from other types of brokerage politics because you could see brokerage politics in a variety of different interest groups. So I want to tease out the distinctions, and then maybe also talk about how is it that a general cynicism that I think is actually very shared across all working populations about the prospect of anything getting done, which makes a lot of sense. How is that specifically weaponized or valorized in the African American community versus other communities? So I'll just put those out there so I don't lose track almost as much for myself. But now, please, Adolph Reed Jr., please step up to the plate.
Yeah, I'll try. My son, who gave a lecture a couple of nights ago, set a pretty high performative bar. But I mention him also because he often points out that the Black American population is the same size as the total population of Canada. And and in line with one of Cedric's points, right, but the idea that all Canadians want X is preposterous, even though they are very gentle people. But yeah, I'll say a little bit about how the Sanders campaign was mousetrapped by the race issue, mainly picking up from a couple of points that Cedric made. But then I want to come back around and talk about where we are now and what it makes sense that follows from the assertion, which I think is correct, that we've won the ideological struggle, right? But I mean, not the electoral one. The Sanders campaigns in both 2016 and 2020 faced same contradictions around race, which mainly had to do with the points that Cedric's made about what's considered Black politics or the Black vote at this point. And it's compounded by the fact, really, that the imperative in an election campaign now is to appeal to an abstraction called the Black vote, which is a construct that's intentionally separate from Black working people's concerns as working people. The Black vote is usually identified with a handful of largely symbolic objectives held to constitute, a Black agenda, made up of items that can be represented as affecting only Black people. In this political moment, that agenda can include such items as ending or at least denouncing, and in some ways, like ending and denouncing in this political discourse basically are the same thing. Mass incarceration or police violence and other race-specific targets like reparations and or political appointments, right, which are often enough, two sides of the same coin. But as Cedric also at least implied, this Black vote is a class-skewed pro forma construct, access to which presumably it requires obtaining product endorsements from Black operatives who sell themselves like athletes sell endorsements. And I mentioned to Kale, I don't know if you can put this up, but it always makes me, the practice always reminds me of ads in Black publications like Jet and other Johnson publications from my childhood that featured famous Black baseball players like Hank Aaron and Willie Mays, announcing how much they liked a particular brand of cane syrup called Alaga from that was made in Alabama and Georgia, with a clear indication that I was supposed to like it because they did, which I guess is why I should have voted for Joe Biden, though I haven't had the opportunity to do so yet. And nowadays, other operatives present themselves as guides who offer to provide candidates with authenticity by association. And I think we see a lot of that on the campaign trail as random rappers that nobody's ever heard of go around with candidates purporting like to give them access to the youth audience or to provide a model for the youth audience. And imperative, but that imperative, and Michael, I think this speaks to one of your two questions, is the going rate in normal electoral politics, of course, and it's not only Black political entrepreneurs who sell endorsement and claims to provide authenticity in that way. All of the Clinton stuff, for instance, and Warren, when Warren's campaign began to get shaky, and she decided, to stress the woman thing, and in part that's simply the way that interest group politics works. And as both Cedric and Willie have pointed out forcefully, that's what all, in fact, everyone means when they refer to Black politics, and especially to the Black vote. And that points to another problem, that in interest group politics, as it has evolved within the constraints of dominant neoliberalism, the electoral realm is not typically a domain for engaging politics aspirationally, for pursuing larger, not to say transformative political objectives. And that's certainly true, God knows it's true for Southern Democrats, Southern Black Democrats, but it's more or less true for everybody, right? I mean, because how many times have we all heard, now is not the time, right? The danger is too great. The other guy's worse, right? But it's certainly especially true. I want to underscore what both you brothers have said about this. I mean, it's certainly true for Black voters in the South, especially in most of those states that are dominated by not just Republicans, but by the most backward and dangerous wing of the Republican Party. People are much more conditioned to vote defensively. And that's what this Clyburn line kind of rests on, right? And this other guy, right? I mean, this notion that you don't go into electoral politics looking for anything. I think Clyburn was pretty clear about that in 2016, as was Cedric Richmond. So the race is still on, right, between the two states. John of all people, right? So part of their part of the function of or the role of the political class is, as you said, Willie, to stifle aspirations, right, and to keep them down. But again, you know, as I said, that's not only true of Black Southerners; it's maybe more conspicuously true there. But I think it's true of Democratic voters by and large. So thus, with the partial exception of the two Obama campaigns, the main messages coming from national Democratic elites to us since 1992 has to when they're trying to mobilize support for their standard bearers, right, has been to tell us that, well, no, the other guy is worse, and our person, he or she, is electable. And they're two sides of the same coin, both of which mean don't ask for shit, don't expect anything, right? So, and of course, I mean, that's what underlay the party's Clintonization, right? Part of the strategy of triangulation, according to which, I mean, the Democrats, in order to be successful, needed to appeal to Republicans like Elizabeth Warren, right? And that's what we've had from Democrats in national politics pretty much since 1992. An important difference of the Sanders campaign is, of course, that it was never simply a campaign to win an election, but was linked also to an objective of building a political movement extra electorally and as well as electorally that was capable of altering the terms and framework of political debate with an eye eventually toward winning political power. I think that since 2016, one of the unanticipated accomplishments of the Sanders campaign, although it's probably not that broadly known or not as broadly recognized as it ought to be, is that because of the way that the race baiting as red baiting and red baiting as race baiting has played out between 2016 and now, I think that the Sanders campaign inadvertently helped to uncover the class character of what we understand to be Black politics, right? That this is because it's forced the brokerage stratum and the wannabe brokerage stratum, broadly understood, those elements of the Black professional and managerial strata with practice or aspirations, it's kind of forced them to argue that pursuit of policies that very clearly and very directly would improve the lives and economic security of the mass of working class Black people are not part of a Black agenda, but are moreover inimical to a Black agenda. So what's the Black agenda? Well, the Black agenda's got to be baby bonds and confronting horrors, pardon me, like the tragedy, really, that rich Black people seem not to be able to pass on their wealth intergenerationally with the same rate of success as rich white people, right? And stuff like that. That gives us something to fight with and to fight over. Now, a lot of people that know me know that I'm really a Pollyanna. So I'm going to turn to be Pollyanna at the moment, and this doesn't apply to people from the Philly DSA who've probably heard me go on 30 times about how you got to approach this like Sergeant Pavlov at the Battle of Stalingrad. But a key thing about the Sanders campaign, and this is where I want to pick up on Cedric's other point about having what won the ideological struggle, because I think that's correct. But there's always a tension between the electoral campaign and the movement building project, and they operate off different logics. And part of the reason that the race issue, or that the racial operatives, the race hustlers, let's just call the dog by his right name, were able to mousetrap Sanders in the ways that they were, was because of the tension, contradiction, really, between the immediatist logic on which an election campaign has to operate. So when a fire jumps out, so when somebody snatches a microphone from the old Jewish guy and calls him a racist, like the impulse is immediately to put the fire out. And I understand that, and that impels toward a certain kind of opportunism, one I'm not crazy about, because I don't have any beef with making the opportunist or making a decision to respond opportunistically. But I think it's important to think through the short-term cost benefits and the longer-term cost benefits before you make a decision like that. And well, I won't go any further, right? Because going much further would require naming names, and it's too early in the evening to play the dozens. but but
You already took on a lot of rappers, so yeah.
but the thing is that I think you've all probably heard that of late the analogy I've been going for is that this thing is like a relay race, right? And the campaign ran a strong scratch leg and brought us a good lead, and that good lead is the ideological victory that we've won. But I've been especially concerned, and this may take me back to Sergeant Pavlov again. I've been especially concerned about the extent to which leftists are inclined to pat ourselves on the back about this, because the fact that a majority of Democratic voters are behind Medicare for all now is a great accomplishment, would not have been thinkable a decade ago, would not have been thinkable six years ago. But it's not going to remain that way, right? I mean, there are three card-carrying political scientists up here, and the one thing that we all know is that preferences are not given no matter what the discipline says, and that support for Medicare for all comes, as we know from our work in South Carolina. And I should point this out too, that in addition to the many other identities that we share, Professor Leggett and I are both minions of the Medicare for All South Carolina campaign. He's a lead organizer, and I just get him coffee and open the car door for him and stuff. But I'm also an organizer, right, in that campaign. And we didn't get, or if anybody got, it was Willie. But in response to our organizing efforts, just between December and the primary, more than 13,000 South Carolinians signed pledges saying that they wanted to vote only for Medicare for all candidates. Now, another problem with the electoral domain is that the tendency for all the candidates to try to slide toward a least common denominator. I want to see how I'm doing on time here. I'm going to shut up in a second. To slide toward a least common denominator meant that everybody at some point sounded like, or could sound like, they were supporting something like Medicare for all. So because a lot of people who voted for Buttigieg or for Biden actually said that they thought that these guys supported it, right? But the thing is that what we've got to do now, right? Like the next, and look, I mean, I'll admit that I've always had a bias, right? That I've always seen the electoral domain as the terrain where you consolidate victories that have been won on the plane of social movement organizing. And that's why I was initially kind of skeptical about what Sanders was trying to do back in 2015, but it's worked, it's clear. And it was the thing that had to be done given where we were in American politics and where the left is and it isn't and was and wasn't. So, but I think that's gone as far as it can, at least for now, for sure. And that now, like, we've got this lead, right, out there, and the thing to do, right, the challenge that faces us, but more than a challenge, it's the work that has to be done, is what Cedric talked about, brick by brick, block by block, house by house, that we've got to build a movement. And Medicare for all is powerful enough in its own right, but what we've also seen, Willie, right, is that when the light bulb goes on in people's heads about that, then it goes on in their heads about other policies that are rooted in a public good framework, right? So it's easier to talk to people about free public higher ed, right? I mean, student debt forgiveness. And also because it's not abstract, because these are problems and issues that they confront in their own lives. So I think I'll stop there, and we'll go on.
This is great. So we're going to get to Bosker's texting me some questions from the YouTube chat, including people who want to know about your Pilates regimen in the back. But besides that, I want to say respect. But I want to get a really rudimentary question out of the way here, because I think it's something that seems really simplistic, but I've noticed in some kind of anecdotal conversations gets lost. There is this whole broader conversation about the history of brokerage politics, then the kind of woke sort of, Medicare for all will, I don't know, if we have Medicare for all, then like, I don't know, so, our favorite, Blackish will get canceled on TV or something, like these arguments and where they go, and just, the kind of ever expansion of nonsense. But what I want to actually trace to, and to me, it gets back to a read of understanding what was actually happening with people like A. Philip Randolph and the March for Jobs and Justice. And I think something we have to be real about, especially in the context of the Republicans, which are the other side of the equation, that there are moves. As an example, the Roberts Court has stripped the Voting Rights Act. There are actual concrete policy sets that target a very clear policy legacy of basically saying, and that we're going to be a full democracy, a full liberal democracy for everybody. And that was, obviously not legally the case until the 60s. And it feels so obvious that it almost shouldn't need to be said, but I think it does need to be said, that as distinct from all of these other arguments, and in some ways I like this conversation because there's so much simplification where it needs to be more simple, and a lot of complexity where it needs to be more complex. But that if we were to say very narrowly an agenda of the Voting Rights Act, or the historical legacy of legal decisions and legislation that formally dismantled American apartheid, obviously that agenda is part and parcel of a full social democratic movement in the 21st century. And that, again, on the flip side, in terms of kind of coalitions we built, this is where it could become very simple, right? I've used this analogy with you before, Adolf, that if somebody came into a meeting and said, I want to fight for Medicare for all, but I also want like you at the back of the bus, obviously that's not going to work. And that's actually really quite simple. Is very different than somebody saying, I want to work for everybody, have Medicare for all and housing rights and so on, but maybe my kind of personal politics and attitudes are more conservative, or maybe I don't care about that stuff, whatever. But in the civic and political space, I'm a supporter of genuine equity. It seems obvious, but I'd like to just really make that connection tighter for people as we kind of articulate this sort of answer to complexifying the electorate and talking about what real, social democratic politics is in our time.
Yeah, who wants to go? I mean, I'll do it if nobody. All right.
Other?
Yeah. Well, look, looks like this. I mean, I've said this before. I probably said it to you, Michael, too. People need to stop thinking about the movement like it's a damn frat, right? Like where you've got to show that you accept the catechism. And I know I'm mixing metaphors there. I'm sorry, Jesus. Where you've got to show that you believe the catechism right before you can come in, right? Catholic Church doesn't even work like that, right? I mean, so like at the Labor Party founding convention in 1996, it was almost terminated before it was gavelled to order, right? Because one committee, there were members of one committee that included one of the founding unions that opposed the reproductive rights language in the draft program that had been produced by the other core committee. We had a big fight over it. The fight lasted for a couple of hours, right? And the vegetarians started eating steak, and people who hadn't been smoking started smoking, and the recovering alcoholics were getting blasted. But what happened eventually was that the people who were opposed to the reproductive rights language, I mean, because the reality was, like, you get whacked either way, right? You get whacked if you stand on principle, you get whacked if you don't stand on principle. And especially in a case like that, then you got to stand on principle, right? But the people who were opposed to it, after making their moves, making their threats, and I won't name any names, but what one of the unions was like a darling of the lefties, right, of the woke lefties too. But they decided and made this clear that they were more committed to the shared project of building a Labor Party than they were to asserting their opposition to abortion, right? Much less dramatically, just this past fall, when I was in South Carolina, actually on a campaign trip, I was talking to a guy, a rank and file at a paper mill in the steelworkers local in Georgetown, South Carolina, white guy, about 40 something. And he said, he liked Sanders' economic program, but he said he couldn't understand why the Democrats kept letting themselves get hung up on what he called the moral issues, by which he meant abortion rights and gay marriage, I'm sure. And we went around and around about this for a while. He wasn't a bad guy, really. I mean, some people might be anathematized to hear me say that, but he wasn't. And where we left it was finally, and like, I'm not saying that he came around, but what I'm saying is that somebody whom he knows and who has standing in his life and his world could probably move him, right, on this stance with a couple of iterations of the same tack that I took, which was to say, look, which is more important to you, right? That you have access to healthcare for yourself and your family, or that no woman can ever have an abortion? Which is more important to you, that you have a right to a job and a decent wage and the protections on the job, or that no two same-sex people can ever get married? And that kind of rocked him a little bit. But then it got to saying to him, well, look, I mean, I'm sure there's somebody on your shift, right, whose guts you can't stand, and you can't wait for the whistle to blow, so you don't have to see that asshole again until the next day or the next week even. But when it comes to doing union business, right, or that business that affects your working conditions, like, you're able to deal with that person, right? And so, yeah, I mean,
versus the path now, which would be, let's start by demanding you endorse NARAL,
right,
versus the other, right? Yeah.
Right.
Well, I don't know. I mean, do you guys have anything to add to that? I do have some questions, but I'd love to. I mean, I do think it's very important, though, to make the distinction on a policy level. Maybe even that's even another distinction, is not caring what people think in their private life about anything, but on a policy level, being very clear that obviously there would never be any compromise on basic legal equity, and then the mass social delivery of a social program for all.
Right.
Probably start with Willie on this, but I'd like to hear everybody's thoughts. But this is interesting. What interests are South Carolina's political establishment still fulfilling, such that they're listened to by their constituents?
What are the, repeat that? I'm not sure I'll follow the question.
I'm trying to. Okay, I'll try to reword it a little bit. So I apologize to the questioner if I'm not reading it verbatim. But basically, what is Jim Clyburn still doing that's actually working for people, that allows him to still have the credibility to have this much power amongst certain voting blocks? Is he delivering anything materially?
Yeah. Yes, he does. In terms of whatever spoils he can get from the federal government, he's been able to get funds for South Carolina State University. He's been able to get grants and stuff for Black mayors. He has delivered some stuff materially for his constituents. I mean, it's not broad public policy, but things that matter to the mayors in South Carolina, they need a grant for water and sewer or whatever they may need. Just a simple constituent services that means something particular. Black people in South Carolina, maybe the South, particularly when that's their first Black congressperson, that they have a relationship that they never had with a congressperson before, and it's more than symbolic. Fairly tangible things, grants, um, things of that nature. And he delivers some things to these folks. He really does.
So okay, so that's important because I keep no doubt Clyburn is not some great progressive leader by any stretch, but I see a lot of people throwing around the pharmaceutical contributions, and that's true enough. But important to remember that he's bringing home the bacon.
Right.
Okay, well that's real. I mean, people want that. Maybe could you start with
Particularly
this?
compared to what they are used to from other congresspersons too.
Right. Professor Johnson, do you think I'll try to read this verbatim. The black vote has come to mean so much for the Democratic Party establishment narrative. Is it simply the importance of the black voting base to the Democratic Party by raw numbers, or is it something else?
I think I think it's something else, right? So this is why I would say that when we think about the actual election at the national level for president, what's interesting is that the argument we heard, the last 2 months was that, from Biden himself was that you can't win the nomination without the black vote, and you can't be the presidential, candidate without the black vote. And in some sense, that's true in these southern states, right? If you're going to try to win, it's less important in the general election, especially when the election is going to come down to probably 3 states. And in those states, they are black voters, but it's not like voters in Louisiana or voters in Arkansas are going to be so decisive when it comes to electing the next, black voters electing the next president. So in a sense, it's not numerically important everywhere, but it is important for this narrative that somehow the New Democrats have the interests of broad sectors of the black population at heart, right? I mean, it's been part of the narrative since the 1980s that they're steering the party in a different direction. They embraced certain symbolic aspects of New Deal liberalism. We can point to in the Clinton years, the national appointments of important, black officials to the cabinet. And so I think it does help with this sort of racial, multicultural patina of the New Democrats. But numerically, in terms of actual votes, I'm not so sure it's going to be so decisive when so much of the black population is concentrated in places that aren't going to really be in play in a national election.
Yeah, so I mean, I want to follow up on that. So then, does it become actually a way? And I'll make this exact juxtaposition. If you read about Bill Clinton, he used the black community to beat up on and demonize to show he was a different kind of Democrat. Now the same Democrats today are using the black community as almost like, and in such a mind-blowingly offensive way. I mean, if you look at it any way objectively, at least according to me, as like, these are the wise elders of America, and they get you can't have health care, and they get you can't really do anything, and we need to listen to their deep homespun wisdom.
The wisdom of Southern blacks.
The wisdom, yeah.
Right. Yeah, I mean they mobilize it in that way. I mean, it goes back to the earlier point I was making, at least beginning to make about even how we're going to talk about this COVID-19 crisis and the shift towards a racial disparities logic that didn't really work that well in New Orleans post Katrina. I mean, everybody who saw those images of people stranded in New Orleans imagined that this was a totally racially driven crisis. And in terms of the post Katrina reconstruction of New Orleans, they made sure that it was multiracial, right? They made sure that there were all sorts of players involved, but it was totally a market-centered recovery, which benefited, property owners, both large and small, and left out, public housing tenants, public school teachers, public sector workers. So I just think it's again, it's become the brand of new democratic politics to incorporate just enough anti-racist, feminist light politics to secure or maybe even deflect potential criticisms, to secure support and deflect criticisms, and at the same time to advance an agenda which is really at odds with, the vast majority of working class people, even those who vote for the Democrats.
All
Oh,
right.
and I'd like to add one real quick thing to add about the COVID-19 stuff. I mean, I agree with everything Cedric said, obviously, like in spades, as it were. But for the last few days, I've been involved more than I would have expected, like in the COVID-19 disparity debate, and I've just been kind of stunned at how the floodgates opened. But one of the things that I've noticed about this is that the stress on the disparity, or the aspect, well, in the stress on disparate outcomes, right? The racial aspect actually seems to displace or to overwhelm the economic inequality aspect of it, right? So the move is that, well, yeah, race is a proxy for other, for a set of indicators of inequality that show up as comorbidities. But the insistence that we focus on the racial disparity kind of moves the discussion away from the structural inequalities that produce it. And I think increasingly, that was certainly the case about Katrina. And right now, I would just add to that the governing class in the city of New Orleans now is more seamlessly interracial than it has ever been, and anyone would have imagined it ever being, right? And I mean, in a sociological sense, right? They go to the same clubs, they belong to the same clubs, their kids go to the same school, they're on the same soccer traveling teams, they're in one another's weddings, they marry each other, right? Than anyone ever would have imagined. And that is the ironic takeaway from or outcome of the naively racialist narrative that Katrina was allegory of the persistence of deep racial inequality, just like the sharecropping era.
So I want to underline that. So when there's no doubt that, like in New York, the acknowledging the reality of a racial disproportionate consequence to this is objectively true. When we center that instead of the class component, we both miss the overall picture, which encompasses the whole crisis, because this is going to rip through Appalachia as an example. And then the other part I just want to be clear about, because this is really where it starts to get really disturbing, which is that if you realize that a neoliberal project is basically saying there's two ways of doing the world. There's sort of, let's have capitalism with white supremacy, or let's have capitalism that has appropriate representation along, quantifiable lines. So what is, 12% of the population is black. Well, 12% of the 1% better be black. And in that discourse, then we can still have a abundance of comfort with poor and working people of all backgrounds dying prematurely because we gut the public health system like Bobby Jindal did in Louisiana. Is that just to put a fine point on it? Is that the problem with that trajectory of discourse?
Yeah, sure. One of them. What do you say, Cedric?
I mean, I would actually say that it does damage to even how we talk about the disparities themselves, right? So they're presented to us as racial disparities. And what that does ultimately actually flattens what are very much class disparities, right? Within the Black population. Right. So everybody doesn't have the same access to healthcare, and not even the same quality of care, right? We could go beyond just simply having access, but who actually has consistent high quality doctors, the best hospitals that they have access to. Um, and I think that's lost in the conversation if it's framed totally as a problem of the Black community and this racial disparities, right? When you look at the situation in New Orleans, and really South Louisiana so far, most of what you're dealing with are people with pre-existing conditions. It's not to say that somebody who's a doctor can't have high blood pressure or professor, um, but the concentrations are there, right? There's situations where people who don't see a doctor, right? Those very conditions tend to intensify, they get worse, right? So I think, and especially in a situation where you don't have the kind of public healthcare system that you had beforehand. So I would argue that the even when people are talking about racial disparities, it's a powerful symbolic language and it's institutionalized, right? So there's all sorts of think tanks that crank out work on racial disparities. There's a number of academics who do work on racial disparities. We can whistle the racial injustice argument just like that. It's much tougher to think about the actual class character of what we're looking at. And sometimes you hear it, right? So I think I saw AOC on television earlier, and she was kind of shuttling back and forth and talking about the Bronx between racial disparities and concentrated poverty, both very much liberal constructs.
Right.
Why can't we talk about it in class terms, right? That would be one way to talk about it in the most direct way. But I think again, we're dealing with a much longer history in which that kind of analysis has been discredited, and it's not financed in the same ways by foundations and think tanks and what have you.
So, but I like that's interesting. So it's like if you put in class into your GPS, you're going to get to the destination of clear analysis fastest.
Yeah.
I think so. I
Okay.
think that's a good way to put it.
Professor Leggett, you want, please?
Yeah, what about to say is one of the things about conceptualizing in racial terms, it prevents you from coming up with appropriate policy like Medicare for all, right? And so as these people now talk about and acknowledge these disparities, it can't bring them to the conclusion that what this population need is in fact universal single payer healthcare system. And the definition of the problem lead itself to a neoliberal solution.
Right. Right.
Oh, right, because then it becomes we can commission a study, we can have we can appoint some specialists, and we can think of and
Or we hire a
a
race
kind
relations administrator.
right.
And we don't want to provide some special programs for
Right.
some Black community or something,
Right.
have more Black doctors.
Right.
Or design a special medication for blacks.
which is I mean, that's the most. I want to shout out Joanna Viest, who I recently interviewed. I mean, that's the part where that learning about that trajectory, I mean,
Right.
God knows in a time when a certain type of right-wing politics is really back in the game, why we would want to be reifying those kind of arguments. But maybe that's a conversation for
Yeah,
another
it's
day.
real.
I mean,
Yeah,
that's
it's a real
terrifying.
issue.
Yeah.
And it's happening actually, because I was in this back and forth on a liberal public health listserv, and it came out just a day or two ago that one of the two senators here in Louisiana, who's a doctor, actually responded to the disparity stuff as, I don't want to be an asshole about this, but as I predicted would be the case, I didn't think it'd just be a couple of days, by offering a biological or a difference in racial biology as the explanation.
Right.
Yeah.
And this is terrifying. And then again, it's funny because that's the right. And that's right. There's more power in that position. I also just want to throw out, I'm gonna have one more question, a couple more questions from YouTube,
Mhm.
but I just also maybe an international example helps too, to kind of take it out of the pressure cooker for some folks. But I've used this with you before, Adolf, and I'm curious if this makes sense to everybody. But in the 90s, after the ANC liberated South Africa, and then they win liberation, but all of a sudden you're in power, but the World Bank and IMF is like, okay, great, but none of the economic policies are going to be on table. the Mbeki administration, who's the successor to Mandela, he generates this discourse of the African Renaissance, and the focus goes from destroy apartheid and then basically redistribute wealth to a African entrepreneurship class, which will exemplify success in the continent. And and in that case, I think it's a lot more defensible because I don't really know how much room they actually have. But this correlation of when you eliminate a class project, what is even available in the vacuum seems to be like a constant theme.
Yeah.
Yeah. Would Jesse Jackson have endorsed, if he endorsed before South Carolina, would it have made any difference from the YouTube?
Very little.
Yeah.
That's, you know, on one hand, the Black political elite have an invisible primary before the primary really starts, right? And these folks had rallied around Biden from the moment that he thought he might want to run, right? And they already have this disadvantage that their constituents immediately know before the primary begins who is the favorite candidate of the Black political elite for the most part. And the game is close to over before it starts to a large extent, unless you have something like maybe Obama in 2008.
Any other, could it have made any difference?
I don't think
Any-
so.
Yeah, I don't think so.
Do you think though that maybe not, I don't know. Yeah. I mean, maybe it was impossible, but I wonder if,
And then, by the way, I just
Yeah.
add that one of Jesse's skills has always been waiting till he can figure out who is going to be the front runner, and then jump out in front of his truck. So
Right.
I see.
jump on the float.
Right. Right. Or maybe getting a little cred when it's obviously over.
Which is a political skill. I'm not really knocking
Yeah.
him for it. Yeah.
If there, I don't know, guys, if there's any other questions from the. Oh, actually, wait. The one other thing I wanted to, let's just get them all out. If we do we have a few more minutes? Can people go another 10,
Yeah.
15? Is that
Yeah,
all
okay.
right?
Sure.
I'm seeing. I don't know if there's a specific question about it, but I'm seeing a lot of questions on the Discord about excuse me, on the YouTube chat about reparations.
Hmm.
So how does reparations fit into this? And for each of you, is the critique of reparations like just the political argument that if you're trying to build a mass movement, something that is not going to have mass appeal is not something you build a mass movement on? That doesn't have any moral judgment one way or another of reparation. You could support reparations 1,000%, not lead with it. Or is there something in reparations that undermines the class framework? And I'm just curious what all of you, just to get that on the table, because I know it's a lot on a lot of people's minds.
You want me to?
Yeah.
So I guess I'll offer maybe three criticisms of it as a notion, right? The first problem I see is a historical point, right? That it actually flattens various moments of repair or progress that we've seen historically, and not only just flattens them, but it diminishes, right, the importance of these earlier periods. And so we've seen reparations before in this country, right? Reparations as it's pitched, in ways we hear now, is very much a millenarian notion, right? But if we go back and look historically, Reconstruction was about reparations. It was inadequate and ultimately overturned, but there was some advance, right? You saw, for a while, Black property owning class people participated in various aspects of public life. All sorts of historically Black colleges were created during this period, and that was rolled back. The Great Migration, which was very much Blacks moving to the North in search of industrial jobs, was a moment of repair, right? It was a moment in which there was some historical advance in terms of shifting economic possibilities, a new life in the North. The New Deal, which takes a beating from a lot of these reparations folks, was also an important moment of historical progress and advance. And um, I'm glad that people like Toure and others have been really diligent about attending to some of the myths of the New Deal. That you had thousands of Black people who took jobs as part of the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Works Progress Administration. You also had, and this gets lost, you also had really specific anti-racist or pro-Black policies within the New Deal, like going around collecting the narratives of surviving slaves who were still around in different parts of the South, in every former Confederate state, collecting their stories and archiving those. That was part of the Works Progress Administration, and so there were a number of things that happened. It was an advance. It's incomplete. To me, it's a problem because it's a somewhat immature understanding of history and historical progress that just creates all sorts of problems, right? You diminish and flatten and disregard the real repair that happened and its significance in people's real lives in order to make the case that, well, nothing's happened, right? Nothing's happened, and therefore we have to have reparations. I think the other two criticisms I would level, in addition to the historical, the ahistoricism of it, it's not a priority for most Black people, right? I mean, this is a thing that frustrates me. Most people are concerned about the kinds of things that we're discussing here. How do I find adequate health care so that my kid with a pre-existing condition doesn't die an early death, right? How do I make sure that my kids are able to go to school? And not only just the neighborhood school, but a high quality school, and that they have a chance to go to college and do better than I did. So there are a lot of things that are much more priorities for folks. And how do I earn a living wage, in this economy? Why is that sort of set aside for a reparations argument? The last thing I'll say about it, and I've said this before, I think Adolf said it as well in a few places. Reparations is sort of like a Potemkin village of Black politics, right? It pops up every now and then, every decade. Somebody pitches it and sets it up. And it gives the impression that somehow this is the politics that unites, the broad Black, body politic. And then sooner or later it's packed up and it's moved on somewhere else. And I don't want to invest any time in that. I mean, I think the best display of it was the congressional hearing we saw. How much has happened since then? Is there a national organization, in the same sense of like an NAACP that's pushing for reparations? Or is it just a notion that sort of survives online, in the ethers, and in these sort of conversations, oftentimes of whites, who think that this is the way that they can do Black politics, right? By being advocates of reparations. So I could go on and on, but I'm interested in hearing what everybody else has to say about it.
Wait a second. I don't get credit for that. Who's next?
Well, look,
Come on.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is, I mean, like in addition to underscoring everything Cedric said several times, I would just say, look, the opening question is, okay, how can you imagine putting together a political coalition that can prevail on this issue? You can't. So why are we talking about it, right? And yeah, I mean, I understand. Like I've had, the go around about this, right? People say, well, don't you think Black people deserve? I say, I think a lot of people deserve a lot of stuff, right? But how is this a way to cut the issue of inequality and injustice that lends itself toward imagining winning it in some way other than going to your Ford Foundation grant officer and making the appeal, right? And I think that's the other facet of it, that it underscores that kind of politics. And that's the kind of politics that's become dominant in what we've all come to think of as Black politics since the war on poverty, basically.
yeah, and another thing, these people don't really see that as a political project, right? This is just a way that I think to carry the race line.
Right.
So ways be able to carve out an issue that's specific to Black people. An interesting thing is when the Black Caucus decided to respond to Donald Trump's "What is it that you have to lose?" in their documents, reparation was not mentioned, right? because nobody takes that seriously. Even, I mean, nobody takes, so when, folks saying they want these candidates to make a commitment to sign off on some study of reparation that's been introduced by a Black Caucus member, they don't put that in their agenda to the president because they're not serious about this. This is something to rally white folks around on one level to say, see how bad you have treated us, and now give me that grant, right?
Yep.
So it's not okay. All right, so that clarifies it. I'm trying to find, guys, you want me to answer that Sanders question last, but I don't see it. So you got to retext it to me. Little real-time production.
Well,
And
may I do one thing?
yeah,
though,
please go ahead. Please do
Yeah,
that.
no, well, I'm waiting. Like, I understand that at least some of the members of our team in South Carolina are plugged in. So I just wanted to give a shout out to the Debs Jones Douglas Institute, Medicare for All, South Carolina campaign, and the team out there who are working hard to make this happen.
Fantastic.
Oh,
Here.
and we'll also add that includes, he's probably at work now, but a key for us there is that Charles Brave, who's the new president of the South Carolina State AFL-CIO, has been a strong supporter of Medicare for All, and like all of the efforts we've worked on there for over 20 years now, right, Willie?
Yep.
And is instrumental in making the South Carolina labor movement a force to be reckoned with in state politics, which is what we're going to need everywhere, to win this.
Right. Professor Liz from the YouTube, I'll go hopefully get all three of your thoughts on this. Professor Leggett mentioned how much more Sanders campaign had done this time. Is there anything else they might have done? Or did we get as far as we could have this time?
Wow. I mean, you have to figure there's always something else that could have done. And they probably may have done better organizing in the state. But Sanders had a lot against him. I think we maybe should be thankful for what he did accomplish. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of forces against him, particularly in South Carolina, given the conservative nature of the state and given the character of the Black political elite. We're talking about a candidate that needed the Black vote to be successful, and every political elite that means something to that population damn near were critical of him. Uh-huh. And that's a tough call. But the irony here too is, 20, maybe 40 years ago, when the whole Black political class saw as a major challenge to have the Black vote, quote unquote, respected. And now everyone's talking about how significant the Black vote is. And it is in fact, serving as a blunt to any progressive change.
Both of you guys, just please jump in if you have any final thoughts on that.
I mean, I would say I don't think there was much more he could do. For the same reasons that Willie just noted. I mean, the way that you have to move so quickly, right, in the context of a primary, and in a state where so much of the decisions that people are making are based on these well-established patron-client type relationships, it's tough to disrupt that, right? You can't just show up. Even though, as Willie pointed out, Sanders had been working for some time, it's tough to break those relationships that are day-to-day, hour-to-hour relationships and high-touch relationships with not only Clyburn, but Clyburn's staff and other people who are his surrogates within the state, right? So I think, having lived in a state very much like South Carolina, growing up in Louisiana, there is a closeness to these elected officials that you can't compensate for in the space of a primary season.
And I mean, I would just add, I mean, like in addition, again, like, I mean, to stressing what both these brothers have said about, you know, the depth and the tentacles that attach to the retail politics there, right? That, you know, just from the standpoint of, you know, thinking about the chatterbox on the internet, that's going to be laying out things that Sanders could have done, should have done, right, whatever. And I'll just be blunt about it. I mean, it's always the case that some hustler that you didn't hire will say, if the campaign had hired me, then they'd have done a lot better. Or some hustler that you hired and fired because they weren't producing, or worse, we would say, well, if they hadn't fired me, well, they would have done better. Or like, this shows how racist the campaign was. They, you know, wouldn't trust the initiative of young black men, whatever. But I mean, I just leave it with, all campaigns are messy, right? And I mean, I agree. Like, the Sanders campaign did about as much as could be expected there, given you know, the, I wouldn't say brick wall, but the hornets. Well, not hornet's nest, but the thicket, right? The briar patch.
There it is.
Right till we
You know,
walked
you know, they
into.
call it the firewall, right?
Oh, right. That's right. Yeah, the firewall.
Firewall.
Right. That's right. Boy, things have changed, haven't they? Well, no, like, the black vote used to be the firewall for the planters in the black belt counties back in the 1880s, right? I mean, they just get that truck full of watermelon and take everybody to the poll.
So what you guys are saying is that if Bernie had maybe silenced more people, no, I'm just kidding. If he had erased more people, he would have done better. I'm just joking. I'm
Could
indulging
be.
myself here. So, I mean, we'll wrap up in a minute. But if there is the core takeaway that as long as there is a notion of a unitary black vote, the full population of the size of Canada, that has a uniform and regimented social, labor, and political interest, that as long as that narrative prevails, it will be weaponized by the, you know, democratic establishment, let's just say, in such a way that undermines any working project and damages those prospects.
I mean, I don't know if I would say it in those terms, right? I don't think it's it's an absolute problem or challenge, right? I think
Hmm.
there are black people who supported Sanders, right? We have
Yeah,
to keep
of course.
reminding ourselves that, and black people who supported the Sanders campaign in 2016 and 2020 did it because we saw in it a vision that we agreed with and that we thought was necessary for the country. And I think that was the right move to take, right? I think that pandering to black people in the ways that Biden has done, you know, and will continue to do, is not the way you build the kind of politics that we believe in, right? I think that's one of the things about Sanders. I think as an individual, and I don't know him, I've never met him, but as a public figure, that was endearing to many people, right? Here's somebody who's been making the same arguments, who's held some of the same views about how a political economy, you know, should work, the system should work, and you know, he made that consistently, right? That was endearing to folks. It's also tough in a you know, again, a briar patch, in a rattlesnakes, whatever you want to call it.
Jesus.
Our political system is.
That's a lot.
It's tough to navigate that.
Yep.
You're, you know, a person of integrity and somebody who's trying to meet people and speak to them on the same terms consistently from one, you know, from one locale to the next. So I'm happy that he did what he did.
Yes.
You know, to go back to Adolph's you know, analogy of the relay race, I think he carried it as far as he could, and now it's time to get more into movement building as well as electoral politics where it's necessary and warranted, right?
Well, let me say this about, I think the way you deal with the concept the notion of the black vote is to bust it up, right?
Mhm.
And I mean by busting it up is politically. And you engage black people. Look, if 85, 90% of black people vote, 75 and 85, 90% of black people vote for the same candidate in the primary, that gives gravity to the notion of the black vote. And so the challenge for the left is to break it up, right? And that comes from real work in which black people see candidates with a progressive message, and as a result of the work that have been done, they now believe this is a possibility. You're not going to build a constituency for, and even though Sanders did much better than anybody thought, the kind of constituents and support that you need only through the electoral process. As Adolph said, now is the time to really to do the hard work, and where people will expect a politician to talk about health care for all, universal health care, Medicare for all, began to expect that. And I think that is indeed the challenge. 40, 50 years of neoliberalism have ripped the political imagination for most of us, right?
Right.
Final note, Adolph?
Hey, no, I think these
That's
brothers
it.
said it. Yep.
All right. Well, again, I really appreciate you all doing this immensely. I think this is really important. I hope everybody will go out and read all of these scholars' work. And if you haven't yet, click subscribe. Tomorrow with Anna Kasparian, we're going to be interviewing David Sirota, actually, to do a little bit of a campaign debrief on our debut show. And of course, tomorrow night, there's going to be a stay at home with Matt Brunig, where he talks about how the Scandinavian model actually works. I really want to thank immensely all three of you, Professor Willie Leggett, Professor Emeritus. Thank you so much at South Carolina State University and I'd also like to thank Professor Adolph Reed, author of Class Notes, Emeritus at Penn, and apparently the coffee delivery man for Professor Leggett, which I wasn't familiar with, but I'll include that now.
Just an organizer in the Debs Jones Douglas Institute's Medicare for All South Carolina campaign.
There you go.
And that's the lead organizer right there. You're looking at it.
And we got to get those links so we can share them and hope and put it in the show notes along with the Teamsters that I mentioned earlier. And of course, Professor Cedric Johnson, professor of political science at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and author of Revolutionaries to Race Leaders, Black Power, and the Making of African-American Politics. With regards to the debate you guys had before we got on, it seems to me, my outside humble opinion, that there's a tie. But I appreciate you guys. Thanks a million. Thank you. Stay safe and healthy.
All right.
All right.
Thank you.